Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get started because this is actually might get a little long. I started with this presentation being about 30 minutes, and then I've had it go up to 2 hours depending on someone who asked, and now I'm trying to shorten it back down to less than an hour. So I'm gonna have my chat window open as I talk, so you can go ahead and type in questions, and if I see them and I can answer them in the moment, then I will. Okay, so if you see me going back and forth as I'm working on dual monitors here. Um, but yeah, let me get started. Presentation on presentations. Um, Slide design and avoiding death by PowerPoint. All right, so the reason it's called presentation on presentations is I was asked by professors here, basically professors were, I don't say upset, they wanted their students to make better presentations. They didn't like the presentations that they were getting. So this turned out to be a presentation on presentations. So basically what they wanted to, they would ask me, what can they use besides PowerPoint? You know, what else is there out there? And this slide is, I think, the perfect example of why they were asking me that. It's because they were getting slides that, I mean, this is not a terrible slide. I've definitely seen worse, but I've definitely seen better. It's pretty mediocre, but it's pretty much the standard. You have a title up there, you have a bunch of bullet points, you know, maybe you have some image stuck in there somewhere, just kind of haphazardly. So a lot of faculty were suggesting Prezi. So this is Prezi, this terrible, terrible slide that has everything wrong with it that the students were creating, except maybe, you know, a prettier design, was made on Prezi. And I like to show an example. And yes, I made this terrible slide because basically the point is it doesn't really matter what slide presentation tool you're using. If you're making the same mistakes that you were making in PowerPoint, it's not really about the PowerPoint. It's really about us and how we're making these slides. So yes, I can make something as creative as Prezi look as boring and mundane as the PowerPoints were coming out. And you know, you can see it, it's just terribly text heavy and so forth. So, you know, why does it matter? Why do you want to make your slide presentations nicer and aesthetically pleasing, if you will? It's to maintain interest. You know, you want your audience to be interested in what you're saying. You want to get their attention span, you know, in there and focusing on you. Um, I, for one, my mind tends to wander off sometimes during presentations. And if the presentation slides aren't well, then once my mind comes back, I'm completely lost. So if the slide doesn't have what they're talking about, if this image doesn't make sense, I'm just completely lost. Good slide presentation is also a good way for the users to retain the information, and it's a really good way to illustrate a point. So you're doing these presentations anyway, it's good to make them aesthetically look good and avoid all the death to PowerPoint. What's death to PowerPoint? I don't know if you've seen this image, but I love it. It's an image of a boardroom full of people who have died because the PowerPoint presentation was so boring. You know, there it is, the title in very big, blah, 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 with all the little bullet points right underneath it. And if you read a lot of articles that will tell you how to avoid death by PowerPoint, it boils down to a few points: confusing graphics, slides with too much text, and presenters who will just stand there and read all the text on their slides, 40 slides out. So here's another one I'd like to put up. I find it really ironic that almost every slide presentation that I see from Bill Gates is, if not this terrible, then close to it. It's ironic because Microsoft is the creators of PowerPoint. And in contrast, on the right, you have Steve Jobs with this, you know, presentation for Apple. It's very clean. It's very concise. You know, maybe you think it's too clean, but you have to admit it's better than what Bill Gates is going on the left. And they're both kind of illustrating the same kind of point here. There's a cloud service, and then the data is going into the devices from the cloud. But Bill has clouds within clouds and arrows going everywhere. And I would hope that when you saw this initially, you could tell that Bill Gates' slide was bad. so you recognize that the slide is bad, and you may even watch yourself making a bad slide, but maybe you don't know exactly how to fix the problem. So that's what we're here to do. And we're gonna go through these steps. And the first step is picking a template, which is letting other people design for you. I mean, I do this, I am a graphic designer, but I don't usually redesign new slides. I just pick a template that I like and then I work with it. How to pick a template depends on your audience. Here's a nice template, maybe for a design company, or if you were going to talk about something that's more artistic. Here's something a little bit new agey. I kind of picture this like maybe an herbal tea place or herbal medicine place. Here's one that's very entertainment oriented. It looks like to me, it looks like a stand-up comedy club, the brick background. And here's a nice generic template that can be used for almost anything. I mean, you wouldn't use it to announce a children's face painting event, but this could be used for pretty much anything business, academic oriented. Nice generic template. So different templates do convey different emotions. For a dark color will reflect more serious topics, whereas bright colors would belittle the serious topic and they're more for happy topics. Also consider what the bulk of your information will look like. Most of my slides tend to be very, have a lot of images, have a lot of design. So most of my templates that I choose are very bland because I'm adding the artwork on it. For presentations that are very text heavy and won't have a lot of images or charts or so forth, then you might go ahead and pick a template that has a little bit more design within the slides. Adjusting a template. Remember I said that I usually pick a template and adjust it, and that's what I did to this one. So this is the template that I'm working on. Very, plain gray with white, very just standard. I can do a lot to it. So I'll start with one. So, but let's say that, I mean, I could have used orange. I'm at the University of Miami, but let's say I was working for a company and my company's brand is blue. All right, so maybe I changed the gray to blue just to be more in line with the company. But then, my company's actually blue and red. Like, let's say I work for Pepsi Cola, right? So I'm like, no, I want it to be blue and red. And then, no, that font is too boring. I'm going to use a fun font. So this is what we call over design. And I've done this to myself. Somewhere between 1 and 2, maybe I can change the text to reflect the red, to have that pop of color to be my company colors. But certainly by 3 and 4, I've gone a little bit too far. There's just too much going on there. You've gone beyond what the graphic designer recommends. So careful when you're adjusting a template. All right, color. Why would we use different colors? To make things stand out, the obvious one. I love this image because this is from Agent Carter. So you have her and she's wearing this blue and this bold red hat, and everybody around her is wearing these drab gray suits. And it really makes not only her stand out, but it kind of says she's bold, she's different, so you would use color to stand out. I'm using it right there in color uses. I made that bold to stand out. Nice red color. Organization is another one. Maybe you do this. You might have different highlight colors to coincide with different specific subjects, or maybe use Post-its for that when you're taking notes. So if you were doing that in a presentation, you might use different colors for a specific thing. Just make sure that you're consistent. So if you're using red to make the highlight color, then always stick to red throughout the presentation to make that highlight color. Emotions, maybe you've noticed at clinics and hospitals, they tend to be blue and green as the color that they choose. They're more calming colors. You've probably noticed that a lot of things that are marketed towards women are pink. So that's also cultural. It depends on which country you're in, but certain colors do have certain emotions and ideas behind them. A lot of the environmental companies use blue and green as well. And then branding. Again, we would use orange and green, but if you were, for example, if I was doing a presentation representing the University of Miami somewhere, then I probably would use orange and green as my highlight colors. I tell students sometimes if you're presenting at a company that you're hoping will hire you, you might want to use their brand colors to, kind of tie yourself in there already with them. All right, so theme colors. This example is from Google Slides, which I use a lot, but you'll find this also in PowerPoint. So once you pick a theme, that includes a certain set of colors and a certain set of fonts that the designer agreed all go well together. Here are my theme colors there. It says under theme. You can add your own custom colors in PowerPoint and in Google Slides as well. So if you wanted to have the specific shade of University of Miami green and orange, you can add them in, or you can select some other colors, but just make sure that you are consistent with the colors. So if your highlight red is that red, make sure it's always that red. Color contrast. All right, so this is very specifically about text on top of a background. This is a good contrast, it's very easy to read. This is bad contrast. Yes, you can read it, but it's not really easy to read. If anybody is colorblind in your audience, they're gonna have a very hard time reading that because green and red is the most common color, I think it's the most common colorblind issue. So I normally say you might be able to read this on your screen. You're about a foot away from your screen. But the person who's viewing this, maybe their monitor is not adjusted the same way yours is, maybe it's dimmer. If you're presenting live and they're in the back of the room, then it might be more difficult for them to read some of the low contrasting colors. So again, just because you can read it on your screen doesn't mean that it's going to be easy for everybody else to read. And you want to make it easier for your audience. You don't want to really make them work for it if they don't have to. So I do have a link here that this PDF will go up afterwards and the presentation. So I do have a link there, Contrast Checker, where you can go and put in the colors that you're using and see if there's any issues with color blindness that the website will pick up. And again, this is for text on a background. If you're doing a Christmas theme and it's red and green, that's fine as long as it's not green or red text on top of the other color. Typography. Typography is not just fonts, but it's also just all the text in general and where you're putting it on your slide. So this is Impact, which I use nowhere else in this presentation. I just use it as an example here. It's the font most commonly used in internet memes. So I like putting fun fonts at headlines depending on my presentation. If I was doing a presentation on Star Wars, that's where I would put the Star Wars font. So that's my recommendation. For body copy, that's what we call everything else, in the slide, not the headline. That's where you would use a standard font. So again, you would use the Star Wars font as the headline, but everything else has to be the nice, normal, readable font. Standards are Arial, Times, Helvetica, Calibri falls in there, Verdana. If you pick a theme in PowerPoint or Google Slides, they might have another default, like the default for this one is Gill Sans. And then their default is gonna be a pretty standard font and you can pretty much, trust it. So yeah, this one is Times New Roman, just for the example. Just be consistent. Consistent is key here for all presentations. Don't suddenly switch fonts in your presentation. Be careful when you're copying and pasting text from somewhere else because your font might accidentally, it might be a different font and then the PowerPoint or the Google Slides might copy it in and then, now you have switch fonts. So believe it or not, these two sentences, which are in Arial, are the exact same font size as the Times New Roman. It looks bigger, doesn't it? But yeah, that is one of those things that's tricky about fonts. Keep bullet points short, and this is the biggest thing. How do I avoid having all that text in my PowerPoint slide? All the death by PowerPoint problem. So bullet points, I usually say 1 or 2 lines long. The less bullet points, the better. I try to keep it under 5. If I'm going too much, you might need another slide. And then I use animations to let the audience focus one point at a time. If you've seen me do it. I have one thing on, and that's what I'm concentrating on, and then I talk about the next point, and that's when I bring up the next bullet point. Instead of having everything on at the same time, people are reading ahead, they're not listening to what I'm saying, they're not focused on what I'm trying to explain, so point by point. But I can't help that my bullet points have a lot of tags. I still, yeah, you think, but use animation, it helps. Edit down your text. Don't forget, if you're trying to avoid, what the biggest complaint about slide presentations are, then it's the too much text. So maybe if you do end up with too much text, you might think that maybe one of your bullet points could be its own slide. Because if you have too much information to put on one bullet point, for example, this, you might use an image to distract it. So maybe if this entire bullet point, that really long sentence, was its own slide, I could have an image here on the left, a nice big image that distracts from the long text on the right-hand side that people can look at if they don't want to read all that text. Just try not to let it happen too much in your presentation. Sometimes I understand it can be unavoidable, especially if you're doing a presentation at a conference where maybe the people in the audience might not get a chance to have the PDF afterwards. Because normally I put a lot of things in the notes. So the other problem that people complained about with this PowerPoint is presenters who just read off the slide. So if you have too much information to put on one slide, it's better to have shorter sentences. And then you can go into deeper, longer explanations in the notes. Like right now, I'm reading my notes verbatim. So you can write them in the notes. Your audience will be none the wiser, and you're reading them to yourself if you have the opportunity to be able to read notes, which is why I'm working on dual monitors, so I can see my notes as my slide presentation is going on. Links. I do have some slide presentation tip links here for you. I also don't recommend that you do this when you have links in your slide presentations. In this case, these links have the benefit that the name of the article is in the link. That's not always the case, especially not in something like a YouTube link. So really this type of long-winded HTML URL is just distracting. It just doesn't look well. I prefer to do it this way, just have the title of the article or the web page up and then create it as a link. But here is my compromise. Again, I understand sometimes you might be presenting and your audience won't have the opportunity to be able to get into the PDF and just click on the link themselves. Maybe they are dependent on just taking a picture with their camera and having to like type it out later. So this is a compromise between the two that still looks better than what I had here to the previous one. All right, so let's talk about don'ts. Don't use italics in large bodies of copy. Italics are usually used as captions or credits on images, but they tend to be hard to read if there's too many italics. Don't use fonts or texts that are too small, especially if you're making them small just to cram more things into a slide. Don't use all caps. I am at the point where I've been conditioned to read all caps as yelling. So all caps is good for a headline, for the title of your slide, but not for the rest of the text. And then, like I mentioned with the Star Wars font, you don't want all the text to be in that crazy font. It looks good for a headline, but it doesn't look good for the rest of the text. And then don't put your text or anything important that's too close to the edges. Depending on the monitor size of whoever's watching, or even if you might be presenting somewhere else that the monitor size, the resolution size is slightly different. And if your text or your diagram, your graphs are too close to the edge, it might get slightly cut off. So I would say somewhere right where that E in because, that's as close as I would get to the edge. Composition. Composition is basically just where you're putting everything on your slide or on your page, because this is also partially for poster presentations. It all goes in here. So this is, if you were creating a new slide, you have all these options, and you'll notice that they already have the composition laid out for you. You'll notice the little, like the second one here with the title box and the content, this little box with the dashes is perfectly aligned to the headline. This one, the title slide, the subtitle is centered perfectly where with the title would go. You know, it does the work for you. This is what we look at in graphic design. As someone who used to work in newspapers, what I see when I look at this is that top black rectangle is the headline, the left is an image, and then the right is 2 paragraphs of an article. But you'll notice that everything is pretty much the same width apart from each other. They're all perfectly aligned with each other. And the slide presentation software does that for you. So you would have to move things around yourself to make it not be aligned. As I've done here in this example, the text is too close to the headline. I purposely shoved it up there. I stuck this image somewhere in the middle. Why is this third line of text so far away from the rest of this? Why? Because I had to hit return after the word photo to make room for my image here. And so now PowerPoint thinks this is an entirely new paragraph, so it separated it. Anyway, you have to work to get it to go wrong. So just follow the templates of the slide, you know, they've done the work for you. All right, images. All right, so using appropriate images. And as an example, I'm going to use Starbucks open position. As some of you know, my daughter works for Starbucks now, so that's where I get the idea. All right, so if I was doing a presentation talking about open positions for Starbucks, this is a very nice image. It's irrelevant, you know, it's 2 people shaking hands, so it's, I guess, sort of kind of relevant, but those people obviously don't work at Starbucks. It's just a very pretty image. This is irrelevant. There's the Starbucks, but it's not a good image. You can't really see the Starbucks. Half the sign, well, a part of the sign is being cut off. I can see the Cold Stone next to it. There's just some random van there. But here's a really nice image. You know, you've got the Starbucks employee. She's happy. She's next to the machine. She's in focus, perfectly lit. So that's a nice, good, relevant image to the topic. Avoid low resolution. And I'm going to say that a lot of the don'ts that I have in my presentation are based on things that I've seen people do. So I've exaggerated the low resolution of this image. You know, I purposely looked for a really small image and I made it fit the entire screen. The thing is, if you're working on a laptop where your screen is smaller, you might not notice that your image is a low resolution until you go full screen or full screen on a larger computer like my iMac here is at 1920. It's very different than if I was working on a Chromebook. So I won't get too much into this, but I do have a link here that can help with that if you need. This is a way to double check your image size to see, you know, if your image will go as far as you need to. If your image is 100 by 100, that's a tiny little icon. It's not going to fill up an entire slide. And if you were making a poster, it would certainly not be bigger than about an inch, maybe 2 inches at most. But yeah, that's what the link is for. And I mean, I do have to say that the image resolution is a good indicator, but not necessarily always, you know, there's no hard and fast rule because with photography, it depends on the photographer. You can have a bad image at 4K. So just keep in mind. Avoid watermarks. Yes, I've actually seen this. People with watermarks on their images making conference posters. Unless I was talking about Shutterstock, there should be no Shutterstock watermark on my image. It's obviously that they don't want me to use it. Maybe it's the perfect image for my presentation, but it looks bad. Distortion. Okay, I'm gonna X out for a second because I do see this a lot. That's more or less where it should be. But what happens is people have a certain dimensional space. And so then they stretch the image out. I exaggerated it, but they're like, oh, okay, oh, that's fine. I can tell it's distorted probably because I have so much experience, so I will call my students out on it. To avoid distortion, you enlarge by the corners. If you need an image to fit a certain space, PowerPoint and Google Slides both have a crop feature. So if you needed this to be more rectangular, you can crop the image, no problem. Yeah, don't do that. Again, I exaggerated it just so you could tell, but I do see that happen a lot. All right, bad layout. So this is what happens when you just stick images on there and you don't follow any kind of, we call it grid. But here's where I would look at everything is aligned at the top, everything is aligned at the bottom, everything is pretty much more or less the same distance as it is from each other, as from the edges. Again, and if the image doesn't fit perfectly into that dimensions, you can use the crop tool to just make everything all nice and aligned without distorting anything. All right, so text on images. Where do I put text so it will stand out against an image? Yes, you can read this, but again, you don't want to make your audience work harder. So choosing an image that you can put text on top of, if that's really what you want to do, then you have to consider what image. Because this image, there's a lot going on in here. You know, there's a lot of different colors. He's wearing purple, she's wearing gray. There's sunlight coming in here from these gray area, even down here where everything looks monochrome. You have darker shades of gray, then here's even darker gray, then white. There's a lot going on. There's nowhere in this image to really put text to make it stand out. So if you really had to use this image, you would put this image maybe on the left, maybe, you know, somewhere in there where it's not a full image, or just don't put text on this image. But it doesn't work in that way. One thing I see people do is create boxes and then put text on top of it. It's not my favorite thing to do. I wouldn't have recommended it in the previous image because it would have had to be really small. But depending on where you put the box, all the different colors would have still stood out. On this image, this box is on what is basically just a bunch of different whites and light grays. And it's not covering anything important. It's really just a reflection of the model in the image. So it's okay in this case to put a box on top and then put some text on top of it. I recommend using, like I said here, a medium box as opposed to something smaller or something that's too large, because with the small one and the large one, to me, it becomes obvious that you were just trying to cover up some image so you could put text on it, as opposed to making it blend in together more as I think it does in this image. But to avoid that, you would just pick an image that has a lot of space that's the same color. In this case, it's white. If you can have an outdoor picture and then it could be like a cloudless sky, that would be a whole lot of blue to work with. It would work well there. I've seen it if it's a room and the wall behind you is all the same color, even if the color is red, as long as it's all red, you can find probably white text to put on top of it that'll stand out. So yeah, this text is nice and easy to read. All right, video, very short, just some video tips. My general rule is videos up to 30 seconds, definitely no longer than a minute, unless the point of the presentation is the video. If I was doing a presentation about some oral histories that I did, then maybe I would show multiple videos and a couple of them might go on longer. But generally speaking, that's not usually the case, at least in the things that I present on. So I usually never go longer than 30 seconds. Yeah, pretty much it. It's usually my videos are usually about a joke. And then another consideration is each video might have a different volume, especially if you're just getting a whole bunch of videos from YouTube. If it's possible to go into the room and be in control of the volume, maybe you'll know that the third video, the volume, you need to turn it down a little bit low. That's great. If you're working off PowerPoint, you can actually do volume control in PowerPoint if you're using your own videos as opposed to YouTube. If you're using your own videos in PowerPoint, you can control the volume on each one. And also if you're on PowerPoint, you can actually, I'm not sure about Google Slides, but you can tell the video to start in a certain place. Transitions and animation. All right, so transitions are from slide to slide. If you're going to use transitions, I usually recommend using just a simple transition for all the slides. Honestly, if you've noticed, I haven't used any transitions. Fade is probably the only one I would go to. But I would say that most transitions between slides, if your presentation is long, they get a little tiresome. And sometimes they're just a little bit, cheesy. But transitions can create some great animation effects. So I have this example. It's a game exhibit that I did, I think 2, maybe 3 years ago. It was a timeline, and I created this in PowerPoint, and it was playing downstairs, the first floor of Richter. And as the slides progressed, so this is a wipe up effect. It looks like I'm just moving through the timeline. And that's the transition effect in PowerPoint. And it's one of the few times that I would really recommend transitions. PowerPoint also has this transition. It's relatively new. It's called Morph. And I have in the notes a link to some Morph transitions that you can look at. Almost all the fancy stuff that you see now people doing with PowerPoint is Morph. But it's only available in the newer versions of Morph, and it's not available in Google Slides. All right, so animations within the particular slide. As I mentioned, it reduces the amount of information on a slide. And you've been watching me do it this entire presentation, and I'm only going to do it slightly differently now by highlighting a different point of my slides. So now I'm talking about the orange bullet point. I was talking about the other bullet point, but now it's a dark color. So anybody who might be tuning in, or like me, gets lost in the middle of the presentation and comes back, oh, this is where they're at. They're on the orange part because it's highlighted. So I think it makes presentations a little bit more interesting. In the notes, I have a series of links of fun animations that can be done. If you've ever seen any of James' presentations, there's a whole lot of animation going on. So once I think you've gotten the basics of this presentation, then maybe you want to add some animation in there to make things as interesting as James' slides. And yeah, some animation is okay for serious topics, but too many animations, and certainly a lot of the animations that PowerPoint allows you to do are a little bit less professional, or a little hokey, a little kind of cheesy. So it kind of really depends on the situation. All right, so I'm pretty much done here. Learn more. I have links that are available. Let me do a small review. Basically, lost my review slide. Follow the template, pick a template, follow the template. Less text is better. Use animations for slides, for the bullet points, designer fonts in the title, standard fonts in the body text. Line up everything so the composition looks nice. Everything is perfectly aligned and equidistant apart. Careful how you display links. As you can see here, I've got the compromise going on. And use interesting, relevant, and good quality images. So there's my entire presentation in about 30 seconds. And here's some more links on how to avoid death by PowerPoint from different locations. There's even a TED Talk about it. And are there any questions? Oh, I got through this in 37 minutes. I could have added more stuff in there. I assume I have no interstitials. So you know me. I'll stop sharing now. If there's no questions, well, our events team or creative is going to have this. We've been recording, and this presentation will be up on the workshops website for Creative Studio, along with a PDF with all my notes. All the links are going to be there, so you can learn more information. And the video will be up at least for the end of the semester, but I usually keep the PDF up until the next time I do these, because I must update this presentation like 2 or 3 times a year. And then my next presentation next week, if you want to come by, it's a crash course in graphic design. So it's basically how to apply all these graphic design elements to different presentations, flyers, posters, and so forth. So, well, thank you, everyone.